Surviving the time. About 10 days ago, I had the opportunity to go and visit Graterford Correctional Facility in Pennsylvania. It was built in 1929, and it looks like it. It is incredibly dilapidated, sad, and depressing place. But what really astonished me was the size of the cells. A lifer who'd been there for 30, 40 years showed me inside his cell, and I was really blown away. It is a tiny little closet with a slit of a window, 2 men in there, and possessions, sad possessions spilling out of a little cupboard, and then an open toilet in the middle of the room. The notion of surviving in such a space for even a month would be difficult, but to stay there as this man had for nearly 40 years was really inconceivable to me. So this panel is asking really that question, which is, how do you survive the time when the hours turn into days and the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months? We have two extraordinary guests today. On my left here is Tyrone Werts, who actually was himself in Graterford prison for 36 years of a life sentence for driving the getaway car in an armed robbery and murder. In Pennsylvania, life does mean life, but in 2011, then Governor Ed Rendell commuted Tyrone's sentence. And since his release, he's received a Soros Justice Fellowship to help other formerly incarcerated men turn their lives around. And he's done some extraordinary productive work. Sitting next to him is Piper Kerman, who's vice president of a public interest communications firm and currently on the board of the Women's Prison Association. But of course, that's not why we know about Piper Kerman. We know about her because she is the author of the book, Orange is the New Black, which has been turned into an extraordinarily successful TV show of the same name. After being convicted of money laundering and drug trafficking, Piper served 15 months in a minimum security prison in Danbury, Connecticut, and as we all know, turned those experiences into the terrific show that we see now. Let's start with you, Tyrone, because having just come back from Graterford, I'm particularly consumed by your story at this moment. You were just 24 years old when you were sentenced to life in prison. First of all, tell us, how did you end up in that car that night, driving that getaway car, and what sort of young man were you at the time?
First of all, Jenny, thank you so much for having me here. It's just an honor and privilege to be on the stage with Piper, and here the rest of the program has been fabulous. Look, I grew up in North Philadelphia. In North Philadelphia, back when I was growing up, I grew up in the turbulent 60s. And I was kind of pushed to the streets, and I was a guy that came from a family of 8 other siblings. I had a mother and father, but I kind of rebelled against my parents, and I was kind of pushed to the streets, and I picked up some really nefarious habits in the street, and eventually led me to prison.
Mm-hmm. And what was your first experiences when you got into Graterford? I mean, now Graterford is under really very innovative management. It wasn't at the time when you first arrived, though, was it?
Right. No. When I first read there, the first thing I noticed was how immense, how huge it was. Not only just the wall when you first approach it, but once you get inside, you can see the enormity of this prison, the long hallways and the noise and the chatter that's going on. And, you know, back then in the middle 70s when I got there, Graterford was a horrific place. I mean, there were a lot of violence, drugs, alcohol, mental illness, and corruption. And that was the environment I was thrust into as a young man.
And how did you fare? How did you get through that first year and the many years, the decades later?
Well, you know, when I first went in, I was really angry, and I was a bitter young man. I was really pissed off at the criminal justice system because I didn't think I deserved to be in prison for the rest of my life for how minimal my role in this crime happened. And so I went in and I found ways to anesthetize myself against the pain of incarceration, because obviously during that time there was a lot of drugs and alcohol, and I kind of got caught up in that because I wasn't able to really deal with the very fact that I would probably spend the rest of my life in this place.
It's incredible. Piper, you were incarcerated for 15 months, which obviously is not nearly the same as 36 years, but it was a hell of a culture shock for you, right? Because this was not anything that you'd ever seen in your life when you went into Danbury, and you were arrested on drug smuggling and money laundering charges. Tell us about what happened when you first walked through the doors of Danbury, and what did you see, and what did you think?
You know, I was a self-surrender at Danbury, which means, you know, I had been granted a bond, and I had been out on bond for actually close to 6 years, waiting to go to prison. I had pled guilty very rapidly to my crime, but there was a long delay while they were trying to extradite, a high-level drug kingpin. So 6 years had passed. I'd been waiting and waiting and waiting to go. And so on a certain level, that day that I walked in, I was ready to get it over with. But the experience of incarceration is incredibly enveloping. I was transformed during that self-surrender from, Piper Kerman, who had driven up to this federal facility, into 111-87424. And the correctional officers who made that transformation happen did not make me any less frightened. They made me more frightened. And when I was placed into general population with the women that I would be living with for the next, I thought, 15 months, because that was the duration of my sentence, I was very, very scared. And actually what I experienced at the hands of those women in those first, 12 hours or so was kindness and gentleness in terms of stepping up and saying, you're going to need this toothpaste, you're going to need some shampoo, you're not going to get any of those things from the prison. So I was extremely overwhelmed. It's an overwhelming experience. Prison is extremely crowded. It's incredibly harsh. The physical environment of every single prison or jail I've ever been into is one of incredible designed harshness. And the entire experience of incarceration is in fact designed to be traumatic. You're intended to be traumatized. And I went to bed that night. I climbed up into my top bunk. I was exhausted, like so physically drained. And I was definitely saying to myself, I don't think I can do this. Like, I don't actually see how I'm going to survive this year, which must seem ludicrous for you to hear. But I think for everybody who is incarcerated, they begin, and the sentence, whatever it is a desert that you have to cross. And so what you're thinking about that first day or that first week or that first year is, how am I going to cross this desert? What am I going to need to survive this Sahara desert that I need to cross?
In some ways, though, Tyrone, crossing that desert is at the same time kind of keeps you going, I would think, in terms of your case, how you can get an appeal, how you can figure out to kind of get out of there earlier. In your case, there was no getting out. How did you cross the desert?
Well, you always got to find purpose in meaning. When you read Viktor Frankl's book, that kind of gave me purpose. And, I had two extraordinary events. It was just so eerie to hear Glenn Martin's story about his education and how someone in the prison got him interested in his case, because that's my story. Early on when I got incarcerated, there was a guy, and I give him credit all the time, Mr. Ernie Bello, who looked at my test scores and said that you read at a second grade level, your math skills are third grade, your comprehension skills are second grade. He said, but your IQ is above average. He said, you can do academic work. And he took the time and he invested in me, and he put me in this adult basic education class, and I took the GED test. And because my confidence was so low, my self-esteem was so low, because of my experience in elementary school, when a teacher told me that I was dumb and couldn't learn, I lost the value of education. And I just show you how sorry I was at that particular time. I took the GED test. I thought I failed it. When I heard that the test scores came back, I went down to see Mr. Bello, and I asked him, how many points did I have to make up to get my GED? And he said, Tyrone, actually, you passed the test. He said, not only did you pass the test, you got the highest score than anyone took the test. And the first thing I thought, I said, if I got the highest score, everybody who took the test must be dumb as hell, because I knew I was dumb, right? That was, that's how I was. So, so as I got that achievement, I went on to school, I graduated from college, and then I met this extraordinary guy who said, I don't know much about you. I don't know whether you're guilty or innocent, whether you're going to get out of prison. He said, but just promise you, as long as you're here, create an extraordinary life for yourself. And I was saying in my mind, that's kind of oxymoronic, because I was in an environment that, as Piper talked about, that everything about that environment said that you're nothing, that's humanizing, strips you of your dignity. And so I kind of found a way to navigate, to cross that desert, even with no end in sight, because...
It's so incredible how one individual can make such a difference to a person's life, and how, in your case, as we keep hearing today, education is that critical thing. Yeah. Piper, you went to Smith College, and there you were in that environment in Danbury. Was there any outlet of the kind that Tyrone talks about for the women in terms of education, in terms of trying to give women some kind of a lifeboat out, mentally at least?
Right. Danbury was not the first women's institution in which I lived my life. I had lived for years in an amazing women's institution, which was focused on making sure that women accomplish all of that they're capable of, and that they have all the skills and the knowledge that they need to do whatever they want to. And it's hard to think about an institution that is less like that than a prison. In Danbury, there was a GED program, thank goodness. Unfortunately, it wasn't very well run, but it exists, and a GED program exists in almost every prisoner jail, or at least it's supposed to. There was very little access to higher education. You know, the Bureau of Prisons is not exactly busting at the seams with the rehabilitation programs, and the truth of the matter is that what rehabilitation programs there are almost always directed towards the male population as opposed to the female population, because truthfully, female prisoners are much more easily controlled than male prisoners because they're overwhelmingly unlikely to be incarcerated for crimes of violence. And in a minimum security federal women's prison, like where I was doing most of my time, I can tell you that, you know, virtually every woman that I was incarcerated was there for a low-level drug offense or for a property crime or for bank fraud or stock fraud or something like that. So,
and did you see any of these women change? I mean, obviously Tyrone, in a sense, turned his life around through education in prison. Did you see any of that in Danbury?
The moment of incarceration, or the years of incarceration, are an incredible moment of possibility for a person to transform. But what I would observe about prison is that for most prisoners, any transformation that's going to happen is going to happen largely on your own steam, or out of fortunate connections that you forge with other prisoners, or with volunteers, or with the occasional caring staffer, because the system as a whole is in no way, shape, or form designed to create those transformations. If that were the case, then every single prison in this country would have a higher education program, because that's a great example of what we know creates the transformation, which allows for someone to never go back to prison. When people get their college educations, either in prison or right after they've returned home from prison, they simply don't go back. And yet, it's incredibly difficult to get access to education if you're incarcerated.
Tyrone, you literally lived through the arrival of mass incarceration at Graterford. How did the prison population change as a result?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, you know, when I went into Graterford back in 1975, actually there were 7 state prisons. They were about 5,000 to 6,000 prisoners. The budget is about a couple $100 million. There were 500 people serving life sentences. That was the state of the criminal justice system in Pennsylvania. The day I walked out of Graterford in 2011, there were 26 or 27 prisons. There were 52,000 prisoners, 5,000 lifers, and the budget had ballooned to $2 billion. And that's in the face of the cutbacks in education in Philadelphia and other cities in Pennsylvania. And I saw the population in Graterford when I first got there was, what, 1,500. It was built to hold 2,000 to a number of 4,000 people, which put a lot of pressure not only on the system as a whole, but in terms of treatment, education, and those kind of things. So I've seen the impact of mass incarceration, the impact it had on not just the prison, but the individuals that's housed inside of the prison, on the prison guards, and on the communities at large.
Piper, I mean, there's obviously, you have said there's a kind of continuum of sexuality in a woman's prison. And of course, in Orange is the New Black, we're seeing the kind of the gay for the stay, you know, constant sort of references to sex and so forth. And yet sex is actually against the rules, right, in a prison. So how does that work? I mean, from your point of view, what was that experience from your point of view? Did you find yourself constantly in sexual situations in prison or not?
For me, contrary to the depiction in the show, it was a long celibate year. I know you're saying, like, what are you complaining about?
Yeah, 30 think about it.
That said, I think that a women's prison particularly, you can comment on what it's like in a men's prison, a women's prison is a highly sexualized place in many ways because of the incredible power imbalance between the women who are incarcerated and the overwhelmingly male staffers, the correctional officers and other staffers who generally serve in women's prisons. You know, they are overwhelmingly male. And so my observation would be that in addition to control of, every single person's corporal being, control of female sexuality was this obsession amongst many of the people who worked in that prison. And so the second day of incarceration, I went through sort of the orientation process, and literally, correctional officers would sit there during the very long day of being, lectured and oriented and say, don't be gay for this day, don't be gay for this day, you don't have to be a lesbian. Now, of course, a sexual relationship or a romantic relationship between prisoners happens, and those kinds of relationships takes all forms. But the other dynamic that's going on is, of course, sexual contact between prisoners and guards or correctional officers or staff. And that happens in every single prison and jail on this planet, I think, certainly in this country. And in women's prisons, that can have a particularly strange and difficult dynamic because of that gender imbalance. And so while that may happen frequently on an individual basis, you see places like the Tutwiler prison in Alabama, which is under investigation by the Department of Justice.
It's a horrendous place.
It's a horrendous place, and it has a horrendous systemic problem with sexual abuse, much like other women's prisons have been noted and have been shut down in some cases, like Otter Creek in Kentucky, which was just like Tutwiler.
Tyrone, tell me about the relationships that you made in prison. I mean, you were there for so long. You must have made so many bonds with those prisoners. And when you walked out, in a sense, you were kind of leaving, in a way, family behind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the very fact that I was there for so long, I mean, I went in at 24. Actually, I was with these men longer than I was with my own family in the street. And I always tell the story that the day I left Graterford Prison, because I had met some extraordinary men there. I know a lot of times people on the outside just see prisons and don't know who's behind the wall. And, even on the website at Inside Out, at Temple University, the place that I work for, and I made this quote that said, the wall is not there just to keep us in, but it's to keep the public out. So people don't know who's behind the wall. But I met some extraordinary men behind that wall who kind of raised me and showed me the way, who actually was very much instrumental in my transformation. The day I walked out of Graterford, they were, because I was president of Life's organization for 20 years, as I was walking down the hallway, there were like 200 lifers in the hallway to greet me. And like I always tell people, I'm from North Philly. I'm kind of tough. I don't cry. I don't show no emotions. But that day I walked down the hallway hugging these guys, looking into their eyes. I was crying like a baby because I knew that these men had such an impact on my life, and that if nothing didn't change, most of them would die there.
It's so tragic that I saw the hospice at Graterford, and it was almost the most poignant thing that I saw. One thing that I was told by Secretary Wetzel and observed by talking to them was that there is a point when you kind of pivot and become a mentor to if you've stayed there long enough. Very often, the lifers become the mentors to the younger prisoners. You've now left prison, obviously, and you are mentoring young men. What do you think could be done in terms of making that a much more formal connection of lifers in prison who can be mentoring these young fatherless boys who frequently end up in prison only because there's been no man in their life?
Yes, well, actually, that is the untapped resource. I think that, one of the painful things for me for sitting up on this, sitting out in the audience and listening to people talk is the language that we use. And I think Glenn Martin talked about this. The language is very important. When we say inmate, when we say criminal, that is dehumanizing, it's othering, right? These are human beings. These are men who are, when they were young, they made some mistakes, and now they're older men, and they understand the things that they did. They want to be a viable solution to solving some of the problems in the community and in the prison. They act as mentors, and they have a unique knowledge and unique experience. In this country, this society, do not see that. They still see them as someone, as we was talking about earlier, as clients, someone that needs help instead of with their own agency, right?
Yeah, there is actually a big untapped resource there.
Absolutely.
Mentors in prison. It's fantastic, the work you're doing with the community. Piper, from your point of view, now that you've emerged from prison, obviously not many people end up writing a hit TV show and winning an Emmy. It's a pretty unusual exit strategy in a sense. Yes. But what do you see that could be done for women when they come out? What is the help that isn't there? And what work are you seeing that is great and that you are yourself involved with for helping women who are coming out of prison?
Well,
very often they have the spouse leave and the kids have been taken away and all kinds of tragedies have happened.
Yes. So specifically, if you're talking about women in the system, women and girls in the system, it's really important to recognize that the things that drive women's involvement in crime are very well known and well understood, because they are substance abuse, they are mental illness, and especially for women, but also for men, they are an astonishingly high experience of physical abuse, whether it's sexual or just, physical abuse, in their personal histories before they are incarcerated. And so some of the folks earlier today were talking about the fact that when we don't address the things that drive people's involvement in crime, or we don't address the things that are driving people's dysfunction or transgression, we really don't have any hope of changing people's trajectories. But when we do address those things, we get unbelievably amazing results. And so, the women that I did time with, almost all of them have come home at this point, and some of them have done incredible, remarkable things with their lives. Whether you're talking about on a very nitty-gritty level, like remarrying and having a family, or whether you're talking about getting their education and, succeeding professionally. Despite the very significant burden of a felony conviction and all of the collateral consequences that go along with those things. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's so important to recognize people who have been through the system as having agency and being the protagonists of their own life and having a powerful impact on the lives of their family, whether they are present or whether they are absent. Like, that absence has a powerful, powerful impact on people's kids and their parents and all of their community members.
Tyrone, what was the worst thing really that you saw in Greaterford, and what can everybody hear in this auditorium? What is the single thing that will be helpful, do you think, to inmates?
For prisoners? Well, look, like I said, I believe that, one of the things we have to do is look at the fact that there are so many men and women in prison, and sometimes we don't really see them as who they really are. They are human beings, and we really need to provide, as Piper talked about, educational programs and programs that will help them in their own transformation. In this harshness and this draconian laws that we put in place, a lot of people think that basketballs or weightlifting weights or having TVs are amenities that need to be taken away because people need to be punished. Well, as Wolfgang said, your liberty being taken away is your punishment. You don't need to do anything more. What we should be doing is investing in men and women's transformation so they can transition back to the community and become whole and healthy individuals to their families and children.
Do you feel that there's... Well, I think all of us are very impressed by the two of you, really. You've both shared so many interesting insights. Tyrone's, I think it's absolutely right that the mentoring of young men is the way to go, in a sense it sounds, from everything you're doing. Thank you so much, both of you, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.